ready to go. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on tackling complex DSARs, the synergies between subject matter experts and technology solutions, brought to you by Exiger and the DPO Centre. My name is Lenita Bishop and I'm the head of DPOs at the DPO Centre and will be your host for this afternoon's session. Please note it will be recorded and we'll be sharing a link to the recording afterwards. By way of some background, the DPO Centre is the UK's Data Protection Officer Resource Centre, and we have the largest team of data protection officers located across the UK. We place them into organisations on an ad hoc consultancy or interim basis. As part of that ongoing arrangement, they go in on a fractional basis, so that could be anything from 1 to 8 days a month. But that also leads into some extensive experience dealing with DSARs, and hence the reason we've joined with Exiger to bring you this webinar. The purpose of this afternoon's session is to cover some key topics, mainly around the COVID pandemic and how the volume have increased and complexity of DSARs as a result, the technology solutions that might mitigate that risk, and also what the future look like. So the session will aim to last around 45 minutes, during which time I'll be posing some questions to the panel. We will have some interactive polls and a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to drop in any questions into the chat and we'll try and answer them at the very end. So it's very much my privilege this afternoon to be joined by Ben and Jihera, who are both seeing the impact of these factors and the increase in complex DSARs. I'm now going to hand over to each of them to provide them with an opportunity to give a brief overview as to their role and a bit of background. And over to you, Jera.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be with you all here. My name is Jeria Laurendi, and I'm a director at Exiger. For those who don't know Exiger, we are the global authority on financial crime and fraud, transforming the way banks, corporations, and government manage risk through our combination of practical practice, award-winning technologies, and process excellence. We are committed to creating a more sustainable compliance environment with a holistic and innovative approach to problem solving. We operate out of 11 offices with over 650 employees worldwide. I work in the Exiger intelligence team, where we commit to an analytic-first approach. We add value for the first time we touch client data. We use proven processes that enable our client to action key information faster and more effectively than ever before. A key highlight of my work and my team is DSAR solutions that work well from 1 DSAR to 100 or 1,000 DSAR in a portfolio level. And be proud and believe that our technologies and proven processes will address the client challenge, most of them, if not all, and make your life easier, which we'll discuss in a little bit later on in more detail in this webinar. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Jaria. My name is Ben Sretney. I'm from the DPO Centre. Lenita did a beautiful introduction regarding the company, and as she explained, we offer DPO as a service. So I'm actually assigned to a few clients across multiple sectors, including finance, research, and healthcare. So I have a reasonable experience managing several complex DSARs and multiple DSARs as well, which has increased somewhat in the previous 18 months, in no small part possibly due to COVID, which I'm sure we will cover in a bit. So very much looking forward to today's discussion and talking about how we can look at dovetailing technology with human expertise.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben. We're going to kick off with a poll just to sort of understand how many DSARs your organisation currently receive per month. And then if you can have a quick look on the screen, answer that question, and we'll come back with results towards the end of the session. So moving on, so COVID, the pandemic, the impact, it's been an interesting couple of months for sure, and data protection has definitely seen some interesting changes as well, with both volume and complexity. And so Jaria, from your perspective, what have you seen the impact of COVID from your interactions?
Yeah, definitely. We talk about the volume and complexity during the COVID, and I believe that it's definitely increasing because the pandemic, led to a significant disruption in many ways, from the economy, our health and well-being, the way we interact with each other. And from the beginning, we introduced like social distancing and stay-at-home initiative. This drove the company to have the online presence, and working from home or working remotely become a new norm. This definitely introduced the new kind, like a type of data or variation of data, and complexity of these as well. Because previously, you know, if I'm in the office, I can go talk face-to-face with my colleagues. I had the client meeting or went to their office, but now like we mostly exchange messages to chat platform, or we do a lot of video call, as well as using a lot of collaboration tools. In terms of volume perspective, like as you know, the pandemic has forced many business, you know, to close their doors. A lot of people have been left, unfortunately, jobless, and millions of workers have been on the government-supported job retention scheme, which, when it comes to the end, is definitely, you know, increasing in unemployment, might lead to the increasing in number of DSARs. Another key point that I would like to mention that may be not related to the volume or complexity that COVID has impact is the new type of data or information. You know, for example, the COVID test result, the vaccine information, vaccine passport we talk about, and also maybe you need to fill in the health form, drop your name and like telephone number when you go to the restaurant, for example. This might not contribute to the volume or the complexity of DSAR, but it's a thing that you need to consider because it might be the information that you can use to identify other people, personal information, or PII, personally identifiable information. Then your data subject might start talking, you know, in the email about, oh, you know, someone in that department, this department who tests negative or who has double jab, or maybe the one who has not yet received the vaccination. That is another thing to consider.
Definitely. And then obviously from a data protection officer, the boots on the ground, or not so much, as the case may be at the minute, but what have you seen sort of from an organizational perspective? What is the considerations they've had to make or adjustments?
The virtual boots on the virtual ground, I think that's really the crux of the matter. Jerry covered that beautifully. We all had an unprecedented move to online working to keep BAU going, to keep our continuity. And that meant that we had to sample lots of different platforms and systems that we never used before. We had very little time. Lord knows all of the IT and InfoSec guys were probably overwhelmed with all the due diligence they had to do in seconds when we had to engage these. But of course, all of those platforms, we start to accrue data in ways that we're not used to. So even the best prepared organizations pre-pandemic now have huge volumes of unstructured data. So if anyone, I mean, firstly, if anyone's tapped into today's webinar after their lunch looking for a bit of escapism, sorry, we've gone straight into COVID and really brought the tone down. But equally, if you're sitting there and feeling like you've got this huge pile of unstructured information, despite having a wonderful, you know, well-organized file system, software platforms and retention schedules before, you're not alone, you are in the majority. So that's occurred, and I think there's probably two other prongs to the problem, you know, alongside other problems. That's Jerry had talked about the redundancies, the end of furlough. There's a move to restructuring that creates not just the health data, but there's also KPIs and performance indexes that have to be put in place for things that sadly like fair redundancy. We in our company certainly act for acquirers or acquired companies a lot of the time. Some of them might have purchased assets from now otherwise defunct companies, which means they've inherited a huge amount of unstructured data that they've never seen before and fundamentally have a responsibility over. And then the kind of perfect storm of all of that is the reduced resources that we have, because all of the guys in admin that would normally be overseeing this are either sadly not there anymore, they're focusing on other tasks, COVID obviously is suppressing the work numbers, or they're still furloughed. So all of that together is bundled up into a huge problem for completing DSARs at a time where at the moment there's possibly more of an intention for people to want to know what's going on with their data, be it a customer or an employee.
Definitely, and I think that is one of the key challenges we're seeing across. But I suppose with furlough and lack of resources, the next question is, how do you overcome that? And is technology the solution, potentially the solution, to help responding to DSARs? Jerry, I don't know if you've got a view on that.
Yeah, sure. Definitely, there are many key challenges that we would like to tackle here, but we have already we co-author the white paper on the DSAR. Then if for those of you who have not yet read it, go and download, and we can exchange some idea afterward. But I would like to name a few challenges that I have found. The first, and the kind of like is important, is the large volume of data and personal data. Secondly, is the complexity of like processing and reviewing various different type of data, and also the complex data type. The third is how to identify the PII or personal information that we touched base earlier on. The fourth is review and redact the text and non-text data. And lastly is how you handling the privileged information and its disclosure, which then I believe we're gonna touch on in a little bit. I would like to give you a few examples that how can we use technologies to overcome these challenges. The key element I think in DSAR is to, the responding within a 30 calendar days, which actually is only 20 to 22 working days, and that is already shortened in itself. And the clock, it does not start when you already have the data subject data in front of you, let alone you have to go to review, identify PII, redact those information, and produce in the electronic version to the data subject. To obtain the data of the data subject requester, it might already take like 5 days, then you already lose like 30% of your time. Then I think the first quick win is to know where your data is located within your organization. You may use a platform that you can do the index like near real time of all information that are available in your organization, and you can simply search for data subject name, their identity, employee number or identification, and then you have the data present in front of you, then you go and start a review. But if you don't have that platform, at least you should have the inventory list to or system of the system that contain the personal data. Then you can quickly identify and you know where to look for data. The second quick win to use the technologies and many analytic techniques to count down the population. Once you have the data all together, removing all the duplicate. With now like many platforms, you can process the data, automatically remove the duplication. Secondly, you may use email threading analysis to only remove all the not relevant, but only review the most inclusive information. There is many other techniques that we use and our client use, but I just gonna pause it there just for a moment, then Ben can chip in. But I believe that technologies together with the purpose built workflow is definitely gonna help the client, to find the best way to responding to DSAR in timely manner.
Yeah, and I think that's the key bit, is the human and the machine, coming together almost to a degree. I don't know, Ben, from your perspective, you've done all the redact, you've found the data, but from a DPO, where does the role of the DPO fit in to with those key challenges?
I'm always excited and nervous when we talk about human and machine coming together. I've watched Terminator 2, so I've been warned. I think for a DPO, it's the front and the back end of that process, which probably presents a lot of the challenges for us. Challenge is always the same. It's resources, it's time and money. And we always say, if you have more of one, you can probably sideline a little bit of the other. But for us, at the front end, we are the point of contact for the data subject. So once we've got past the important rigmarole of things like ID or authority to act on behalf of the data subject, we're going to start thinking about scope setting and such for obviously the discovery, which is what Jerry has just talked about there. And then at the back end of that, we have the QA, the quality assurance, in terms of what's being delivered to the data subject, explaining some of the exemptions that may apply to the controller and whether they want to apply those. And they're all quite technical challenges in themselves. And I think right at the very beginning, the important part for a DPO is communicating with the data subject, understanding what it is they want. More often than not, we can turn complex DSARs into reasonable DSARs if we understand their intention. But equally at that point, there's a little bit of perception requirement, which is, understanding if we could potentially look at if the request is unfounded, if it is manifestly unfounded or potentially excessive. Those two tend to go together, which means we have a choice to either reject it entirely, or we can talk to the controller about whether they wish to proceed with a small fee. It's one of the rare areas we can charge, not to be dissuasive as such, but there is an option to do that. And then all the way through the process, we're looking at what is viable in terms of the time frame. Do we need to request extensions, which all builds into how much data do we have to discover, deduplicate, redact, remove third-party references. It's an exciting time, as you can imagine from what I'm saying here. And then documenting that as we go along, documenting our exemptions in case we're challenged subsequently by either the data subjects or heaven forbid, the ICO. And I think technology, to answer that second bit before Anita jumps in and asks me another challenging question, no doubt, is for me, technology can automate some of that middle process. It can, exactly the things that Jerry talked about there. And if we can work with the machines, as it were, for deduplication and discovery and production, it gives us more time to consider the correct application of some of those contextual things like application of exemptions. And I think that's where the two fit together.
So just rolling back a bit, manifestly unfounded is one of those words that everyone, I think, is probably keen to understand a bit more about. Is there an example of a case where you can sort of explain a bit more? Because I suppose it's, from a controller's perspective, manifestly unfounded means one thing. From a data subject's perspective, something very different. Is there any context you can give around that?
Absolutely. I mean, in itself, being manifestly unfounded is fundamentally the data subject has no real intention to claim the data. So, or worst case scenario, they're looking to harass the controller, the controlling organization. So I think historically, if we would see the DSAR being used maybe for leverage in maybe a commercial or an employment setting, with the absence of guidance, I think people would panic, and quite often we would just complete the DSAR when we had more important things to be getting on with. But as that's progressed, the ICO have recently issued us some guidance and indications, and also there's recent court case, which is Lees and Lloyd, 2019. For those who struggle to sleep and want to go and look up some court information. But what that allowed us to do was understand that if there is a very clear abuse of process afoot, then we don't necessarily have to process the whole DSAR. We can reject it. So if they're just using the DSAR application to frustrate the controller's actions or to gain disclosure ahead of litigation, which sadly do tend to go together, then we can potentially document our reasoning and then reject the access request altogether. Again, they're things that give DPOs and controllers sleepless nights, even before we get to the requirement of the system to do data discovery. But if we know we can compress that middle bit, we can take a little bit longer at the front end, reviewing those actions and getting them right. I think that's where the importance of the two comes in. Okay,
thank you. Now, sort of touching on the other element of that, the definition of privilege. Again, I suppose that is, different sectors, different, scenarios. But from a technology solution perspective, how do you feel? How can technology potentially mitigate the risks associated with privileged information? I know Jara obviously Exiger does a lot of things around sort of e-discovery and tools. Can you sort of explain a bit around how that works and interacts with the DSARs?
Yeah, sure. Then I would, confirm the same, that I think we definitely require the technologies, and we also need to seek, advice from the legal people who can make a decision on the privileged or not privileged information. But the technology, they did definitely like a various technique that technologies can come in and help here. Then when we apply this, we just need to ensure that we haven't disclosed the privileged content to the data subject. And all these techniques that I'm just going to talk about in a moment, it can be applied, at the very beginning for the full of your data set, then to help to remove the certain privileged information that you can withhold before you disclose it to a data subject. Or the other way of using it, you can use it as a QC check toward the end. After you have the final production that you're just about to release to the data subject, you do another QC check to ensure that you don't disclose this privileged information. And the few techniques that we can use here. The very basic, the first one is to using straightforward, the search term. You can construct the Boolean search term using proximity search. The all-time favorite or kind of like a quite straightforward search term that people use might be, you know, the astronomy, client privilege, the privilege and confidential. But all of this is still, you know, it can give you a lot of false positives. That's why we need to combine it using the proximity search to ensure that this such language is not hit on the disclaimer or the client or the signature on the email. The second thing that it might be another layer that you can lay on here is to search for the exact email or the name of the outside or inside counsel. But this is, you need a collaboration within the organization to contain like this information. And again, this thing can also give you the false positive because many outside counsel may represent clients in a number of different capacity, including you know, negotiation of the agreement that would be like not privileged in certain extent. The third that we also use within Exiger as well is a machine learning, or we build our model like privilege model. The way that we're doing this, we first identify the condition, the criteria, and then we review a big population and make the binary decision whether this like a content, like the four corner of your document is privileged or not privileged. And then when we have the stable model, then we can plug in or apply this model on a different data set to identify whether those data sets, how likely or, you know, how the system thinks whether, you know, it contains a privileged information. Yeah, then many other criteria that we can use, but that is kind of like a few things that I would like to point out.
Okay, well that's very interesting, to be honest, and what technology can do nowadays. But Ben, I suppose from the human side, if you like, defining privilege as a risk-based approach, or what is your view?
Firstly, it's nice to be referred to as a human. It doesn't happen too often, so thank you for that. I think privilege in itself could be incredibly challenging because it's not necessarily the standard, you know, the document or who it's to, who's receiving it that attracts privilege, as Jaria said. So we have that first bit where we can put in those search terms, and that can trim down the nature of the scope, which is fantastic. But also we have to understand potentially not all interactions between a party and their legal advisors will attract privilege, and likewise we don't necessarily have to have the legal advisor included in those communications for certain privileges like litigation privilege. So we start with those general definitions. You know, legal privilege has to be you know, imparting confidentiality to seek legal advice. And then we have to, I think the machine learning is the exciting bit, which is the individuals, the humans, adding that context for the machine to learn when, for example, with litigation, where things really get very tasty, you know, to help the machine understand that within a document that litigation is contemplated or it's afoot, and that's what the nature of the document regards. If the dominant purpose of the document is regarding the litigation, and also if it's adversarial in nature. So I think it is a risk-based approach. Definitely some DPOs who will overview these systems and advise them to or not to the controller will absolutely shy away from them for fear of the risk and the penalties of misappropriating documentation during this process. But equally, I think, you know, if you do integrate it and you provide that correct context, like Jerry said, what we're doing is we're trimming that scope right down. So the grey area documents, we have to look and decide whether they attract privilege, which will always be a very, very subjective moving feast. I often say I've had many, many experiences of sitting in a room with internal and external legal counsel, and all of us with very differing opinions. But the fewer number of documents we can get that to by correctly utilizing the machine, I'm going to stop saying machine, it's unnerving me, by using the software to completely remove the very obvious stuff, gives us time to refine that eventual submission, which effectively will reduce inaccuracies and also hopefully save us time and money, which is very much what it's about. So it is a risk-based approach, but I think we can reduce the risk in many ways by having a smaller pool of, like you say, privileged information that we have to make a call on, and other exemptions as well.
Very interesting indeed. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try and cover them off before the session ends. Sort of leading on to the final question, for the first poll results indicated that 75% of today's attendees receive up to between 1 and 10 DSARs. So clearly, you know, enough to keep organizations busy. But for you two, where does it end? You know, and what does the future look like? Jaria?
Yes, I don't think there'll be any ending. You know, because as long as we have regulation, we have law, and then, you know, most of us need to comply or obligate to perform like our duty as the best as possible. But definitely, it's obviously the impact that COVID has. More information out there, more complex type of data, more variation. Then I think we just need to come up with the solution, or, you know, like spend a little bit of time before it hit you, before you receive your first DSAR. Maybe at least think about where your data located. You have that in mind. You already established the connection with all of the other department. Then you know when the thing come in, where to look at, who to speak to, and you know, talk to the service provider. You don't need to spend a lot of money on buying the software technology yourself. We are here to help, exchange some ideas, and, you know, see that how can we help you with that.
Ben?
I think it's not going away. Sadly, for those who hope that would be my answer, would be to the contrary. Access rights have been developing throughout the history of data protection law since the '95 directive. You know, we've developed it, and the GDPR just did more so. Even the Data Protection Act has kind of fleshed it out slightly. What we're going to see, or what we hope to see, is more guidance because of the importance of this. And I think that there's both progress in terms of what the ICO is providing, but also recent case law. We discussed earlier the Lloyds and Lees case, which talked about when, as controllers, we might have a bit more ability to nudge back for requests that are not made in a bona fide fashion. But on the flip side of that, potentially, we're waiting for some outcomes of a Supreme Court case, which is confusingly Lloyd and Google, different complainant. And that effectively, as it's made its way through the British courts, the High Court and the Court of Appeal, has created a position where there doesn't have to be pecuniary loss for damages to be awarded for loss of control of the data, in this case, data breaches. But there's no reason why that won't be extended by some wily legal minds to really cover the loss of access, and how that's not managed correctly by certain companies that might remain nameless but often feature in the news. But also it's about extending that class action position, which has been increasing more and more into a representative action. And that could be problematic because we're talking about, in the Google case, 4 million potential claimants in the breach. And all you need to do is establish that someone's not affecting your lawful right to access and control of your data. Potentially you have damages claims for large amounts of individuals. So they're going to be different jumping off points as the case law increases, but we've only really seen it go one way. So that's kind of how I see it, with fits and starts, but that's how I see it progressing.
Definitely seems like the tip of the iceberg. General data subjects appear to be more aware of their rights. You know, so 3 years in after GDPR, I think it's just a general better awareness, really, and people understand that it's, you know, something they can use and it's free of charge. So, but that was very useful. Thank you both. Before we head into, I can see there's about 3 questions in the chat. We've got a final poll question. If that can please be brought up, there we go. Just from, you know, your main consideration when assessing a DSAR solution, you know, what are you looking for? We're quite interested to sort of see if it's ease of use or flexibility. That's the main driving force. So we've got a few questions. First up, I've got one asking, doesn't mention to who, but I think we could go to Jaria first. Some tech companies offer one-click downloads for all personal data, i.e. Facebook and Google. Should all companies which create customer accounts consider implementing similar functionality?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of company, what service they provide, what kind of client information or customer information they may have, and they may have to do the cost analysis on their end if they have to invest to build up the technologies or the portal that people can log in and retrieve that information, is it worthwhile for them? But definitely worth considering, and it depends, if you never received any DSAR request before, is it worth like spend money and building this system now? Or it might be good if you have time in your hand, and it might be the exercise that you might want to do internally anyway to understand where data located. That you might, if it's quite straightforward for you, you have the people to do so, then it might be a good option for you to have. Then you don't need to have a headache when the actual DSAR like flowing in.
Anything to add, Ben?
Yeah, I think the idea of self-service portals are very commendable. I know there was a lot of chat at the beginning of the GDPR coming into force about how that would be the future. I think that's great to allow people to have greater control. Lord knows it's going to reduce the burden on controllers, technically speaking. I think it works best or really only when those one-click solutions deliver the entirety of deliverable personal data. So it works for a small group of companies, maybe the ones that are cited, providing there's no background processing and collection of data that isn't being delivered to the data subject. So technology will definitely assist with this, enable us better retrieval of information and possibly moving on, assuring what's being delivered. But I think as long as it's not used to placate data subjects and kind of push them away without delivering correctly what needs to be there, in which case it's not a solution. So for some, it's going to work well, depending on the nature of the information and the nature of the data subject. But I don't think it's a cure-all for everyone right now.
Yeah, definitely. And then we've got another question from Katrina. When we think about conducting redactions for third-party data, how should we determine those names that should or should not be disclosed? Interesting one. Quite keen to hear your views on that one. I don't know, Ben, if you want to have a first attempt.
Yeah, I think every DPO has a different process, and then this gets very contentious at later points. I tend to put it in the scoping element at the beginning in terms of instructions for the protocol. Your general rule, of course, is not to disclose the information to third parties unless they've clearly consented to that. So we'd want to be redacting it, and of course any information that pertains or identifies them, which means it can get very difficult when they've clearly undertaken an action which identifies them. It's not just a case of removing the email address at the top, which is what we tend to see, and then a chapter and verse about the individual later on. There are exemptions that apply to that, of course. There are certain things such as an individual undertaking their professional obligations where that wouldn't be applicable. And I'm always very cautious not to start advising on webinars. But I would say, how do we determine whose name should or should not be disclosed is really about ensuring that the individual, the data subject, is getting the data and the information they require, and absolutely nothing further than that. So that's when you would draw the kind of threshold as to giving other individuals. But I do also grant, in case that individual's asking me about things like medical records and such, there are clear exemptions that apply to that. And I hate to be the person who says it's context dependent as a get out of jail free card, but it really isn't that case. General rule though, third parties redaction unless they've consented, and then you apply the specific exemptions to that.
Okay. Jerry, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Definitely I can chip in. I think it's good that start with Ben. He can get perspective from DPO, but I'll come from the technology's perspective to make the life easier for everyone. Now they got many technologies in natural language processing to identify all this information of the name or like PII that we mentioned previously. Then easily when you run the automate solution or technologies underneath it, and then you can identify all the available names or the likely to be names, the company name, the individual name, then you can review in bulk. And then, if you want to kind of double check, because otherwise if you have to go to like 10,000 documents to redact this one by one, it might be complicated or might be time consuming for you. But if you have technology to help, then it should be able to help you save time, and you can make a consistent decision. Because when you make a decision of, okay, this can be disclosed, not that cannot be disclosed, you can apply like automatic redaction solution to be able to redact everything in one go. And again, still the human element toward the end to QC that everything looks perfect.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a final question. Do you think increasing volumes of DSARs will force companies to change how they store all data, not just personal data, to ensure it's possible to respond quickly and cheaply. Jaria, I think it's very much a technology one that for you guys.
Yep, I think it's good to be prepared. Then, now the company might have to be a little bit more organized with the number of data. And now, we all work from home, different system, a lot of data sit on the laptop, many of them sit on the cloud. Then we just need to make sure that this inventory list that I mentioned about is up to date. Then we can quickly identify where the data located. And yeah, I think it's good to be recognized, organized, and it depends on the company again. As long as you have procedure in place, even you don't have the technology straight away, but if you know where your data are, who to speak to, and where to get those information, then it might not be the quickest, but at least it will get you there as well.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think we're very much at the closing comments, and from the poll results, 50% of today's participants indicated that ease of use is very important for them when it comes to a platform solution, and I think that just dovetails very nicely into everything we've discussed today. It's about making life easier, but also adhering to the regulation and the requirements of the request. So very interesting overall. But just sort of closing comments, Ben, anything you want to sort of just wrap up with?
Yeah, I'll keep it light, keep it positive, as is the theme of our COVID-based discussion. I think don't give up. It is always the attitude. It doesn't matter if you're staring down at a huge pile of unstructured data that you've collected in the past 18 months or the past 18 years, whatever it may be. It's not worth just turning around and walking away. Review the actions that you need to put a sensible protocol in place. Build that protocol, train it into your staff, review the software that you may need, train into that software. Build a roadmap to effectively execute that. So when you do have the DSARs knocking on your door, you can process them nice and efficiently. But equally, that's very glib for someone who's sitting here and panicking and just received a bundle of DSARs or a complex one. So don't panic, it is the advice to them. Take advice where necessary. Communicate with the data subject, identify what they're looking for, what their intention is and what they need, as we talked about at the beginning. And in both cases, document what you're doing as you move through, learn from the process, improve your protocols, and you'll start to build efficiencies, and it will become far less of a burden. But the end point is worth it in the end.
Thank you, Ben. Jaria?
Yep, I have since the lockdown, I have a lot of time spared, and I've been reading a lot of books, self-help books, to keep myself sane. Then I'm gonna say two things I get from extract from the book that I've recently read. It's called The Gift of Imperfection. First, you are not alone. If you receive your first DSAR or your organization doesn't have things in place, you are not alone, because we all have to obligate the same rules and law. Then if you zoom out, you will see that many of you are in the same boat. Some of you might already have the solution in place. Some of you might not. Some of you might not know at all what to do. Then go back to Ben, don't panic. And the second thing, don't be afraid to reach out or ask for help. There'll be a lot of service provider out there. Exiger is one of them. I'm more than happy to want to have a chat, exchange ideas, and to see whether I personally or Exiger can help you to challenge to address any of your challenge. Then don't be afraid of getting help. Yeah, that's for me.
Great. Well, a big thank you to you both for your time this afternoon. I'm sure everyone has found it very interesting. I certainly have. If any of the attendees have got any further questions, feel free to reach out via LinkedIn or our respective company pages. We will follow up with an email with a link to the white paper as well, for those that haven't been able to download it. But just a massive thank you to you both, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye.